Good afternoon. It's me again. Sorry. Nature as an asset class. I'm going to start by just again framing why is nature so valuable. And again, I'm going to concentrate on the economic aspect of nature. As I said earlier, it's the very foundation of our economic structure, and I think by now we all understand that. There's one thing that we may not all understand, is the role that nature is playing in basically a transition to net zero. Nature is both a carbon source. It represents about 20-25% of global emissions coming from land use and land use change. But it is also, more importantly, a carbon sink, because it basically absorbs about 60% of the total flows of emissions. But more specifically, if you just look at land, terrestrial land sinks, it absorbs about 50% of our industrial emissions. So just basically thanks to mostly what are tropical forests, we can absorb every year half of the carbon dioxide pollution that we're putting into the atmosphere. So again, from a macro perspective, if we're going to be very, very simplistic, we would say if we are moving towards a fully priced carbon world, and again, let's assume, like we tend to think a little bit in Europe with the compliance market, that we get to about $100 a ton per carbon emission. This means that land assets or terrestrial sinks, and mainly again tropical forest, plus oceans, are absorbing an amount of delivering 3.9 trillion of ecosystem services. And it's quite important actually also in the debate between the North and the South, because at the time where effectively the North is putting a price on emissions, effectively the South is completely entitled to saying, but actually, we are dealing with half of your problem on a yearly basis, and we should be seeing part of this money. So again, how it pans out is going to be difficult to assess from here, but nature, purely from an ecosystem services perspective, in a fully carbon world, could be bigger than global real estate. Now, it is interesting because if we sort of all agree that nature is a very valuable asset and that it should basically get a price or a value, particularly for those essential nature assets, it's interesting to notice that we are deteriorating it basically every day. And what, as I was saying this morning, what sits at the middle or at the heart of the nature problem are our food systems, which represent about 85% of the problem. It is important because when you look at food systems in their entirety, it's only a third of global emissions. But it is 90%, it's responsible for 90% of global deforestation, which is one of the most important planetary limits that we have hit. It's also responsible for 70% of freshwater use, and it is also responsible for more than 50% of soil degradation. It's interesting to see also why our food systems have such a big negative environmental footprint. There are basically three issues. And again, we have much more educated specialists on the topic of our food systems. And so I will try to, I'll be very humble on the topic. But essentially, there are three issues. One is that to feed the world, we are relying on an ever-expanding agricultural land. Today, 50% of the total planet habitable land has been effectively colonized by our food system, by agricultural land. And this is the biggest source of deforestation because effectively, as we increase our agricultural land over the habitable land, we are basically taking down forest. The second issue is that 98% of farming practices or agriculture rely basically on what we call traditional agriculture, i.e. very heavy artificial inputs. And that is degrading soils to, again, a limit that is putting at risk our planetary systems. And then the third issue with our food systems is that basically, when you look at it, about 77%, so call it 80% of our agricultural land is actually used to feed animals and not human. So we are basically living into an environment where we take from nature, it's highly extractive, and in doing so, we have reached the sustainability limit because we've degraded soils, we kept deforesting, and we are producing not necessarily the right type of food. So the good news is that there would be a solution, and there is already a solution, and the challenge of this solution is to make sure that we can continue to meet the demand of global feeding. We need to be able to feed an ever-growing population. We need to be able to feed it at a low or affordable price. And we need to be able to feed the population working with and not against nature. And we need to create better economics. Now, the good news is that regenerative production systems in certain food commodities or certain food crops will achieve exactly this. And that's really good news because there is a part of our food systems which can already start to shift towards regenerative production systems, which actually, again, in certain crop or in certain commodities deliver similar or if not better yields, don't rely on artificial inputs, therefore it's cheaper to produce. It delivers much greater resilience on effectively the land or the part of nature that it uses, and therefore it creates a much longer life asset. And last but not least, it delivers higher quality crops, and it delivers crops or commodities that have this climate and nature value embedded in it. What are the catalysts for these changes? It's basically the world is moving towards a need for climate and nature positive crops or commodities. And for a variety of reasons, the demand right now for this kind of commodities is outstripping supply, and outstripping supply very, very fast. Demand for nature positive or climate positive commodities or food crops is increasing very fast for a number of reasons which I won't go into it: adaptation, mitigation, or indeed the role that policy is playing with it. Now, the challenge, of course, is that if there is a better production system, if there is one that can actually create these nature positive or climate positive food crops, the question is, how do we unlock the capital that is required or the investment that is required for this transition? And here, around food systems, most food systems, not all, we're dealing with effectively a big problem. When you look at the value chains around consumer-facing companies, food, textiles, and a few more, basically you have 80 to 90% of the economic value generated downstream, with 10 to 20% of the economic value generated upstream at the farming level. And typically, this population tend to be capital constrained, if not very unprivileged or poor. This is not the part of the value chain that has the capital available to invest in developing new production systems. The capital sits downstream. And that's very, very different with than the energy transition. The challenge here is how do we move the capital that is available, which sits downstream, to where it's required to changing our production systems, i.e. upstream. And there are various discussions going on about how to achieve that, but probably the reality is some of these food value chains will need to be reconfigured. And again, to go back to my Tesla example of this morning, this is exactly what Tesla started to do with the electrical vehicles. The first thing that they did is that they took out the dealership and they went direct. And then they started to reconfigure more and more the value chain. And I will give you one example, which is probably the easiest example, but just to illustrate a little bit how, nature is potentially going to emerge as an asset class and how these changes are going to materialize. And I'll give you the coffee example. Coffee is an interesting commodity because it's one of our most valuable soft commodity. A lot of people in the world drink coffee every day. But for every single kilo of coffee that we drink, we emit about 20 to 25 kilo of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is the environmental footprint of coffee, pretty much everywhere. The other reality of coffee is the value chain issue which I have described. So it's a 220 billion market. It's quite significant, with only 20 billion of the economic value produced or generated upstream, and most of it basically generated downstream. Now, the good news with coffee is that we know that there is a better system, and this is basically moving from what is today, for the most part, monoculture plantation to effectively regenerative agroforestry model. And we know that by doing so, which basically involves taking your monoculture plantation, planting many, many more trees, planting many more species of trees, creating different layers of canopy, and obviously doing away with artificial input, you're getting to basically this picture here, which looks like a tropical forest underneath of which grows coffee bushes. And that basically delivers phenomenal results for coffee because it basically delivers similar or if not better yields, depending on the coffee plantation. It creates a better quality coffee, so it allows you to basically target more the specialty coffee market, which has a higher value and which is the fastest growing part of the coffee. And last but not least, it creates also this climate and nature value which you can embed into your coffee bean and which can be quite valuable. Now, of course, again, to go from conventional monoculture plantation to agroforestry model, we need capital. And the only way to make effectively the investment worth it is if we can basically generate an interesting return, because otherwise we can't mobilize private sector capital. And to generate the type of return that we need, we're going to need to be able to sell that green coffee bean at a premium. And so the challenge becomes how to absorb effectively this premium that is basically going to be realized in that new coffee bean, how to materialize, how to absorb that premium without making the cup of coffee more expensive. This is going to be a recurring challenge across food systems, how to change the upstream, i.e. our food production, move towards regenerative systems without making food more expensive to consumer. And the good news with coffee is that there is so much pricing space in the existing value chain. There is so much pricing space in the, sorry, I should just, sorry. The good news is that there is so much pricing space in the existing value chain that this premium can be easily absorbed. If you think about your roasted bean of coffee at 100, effectively your green bean today costs about 20%. We're looking to effectively put a 50% premium on that green bean to make it effectively climate and nature positive. But the good news is that can be easily absorbed within the very significant margin that exists in the value chain. And the key question, which obviously could be a discussion, is how can we absorb such a premium? And there are going to be two factors for that. First is that most, if not all, of the big coffee companies today have a mitigation issue and they have an adaptation issue. And the reality of coffee is that with climate change, everybody knows that about 50% of the existing coffee production is at risk. So basically, unless we do something, the prices of coffee is going to increase very significantly. That's the point one. And then point two, these big coffee companies have also made net zero commitments, and they know that 95% of their emissions on average is in their supply chain, so they're going to need to basically start to pay for that emission reduction, which can only happen upstream. But there's another more important reason why this premium can be absorbed. It's the value chain reconfiguration. Effectively, the coffee value chain today makes little sense. You have about 19 or 20 participants from production of green bean all the way to roasted bean, and there are margins being taken everywhere. So in a world where consumers are going to require traceability of commodities and food crops, effectively end-to-end integration of coffee production is also going to create a great return opportunity. So I will finish off by, again, going back to the question or the argument that actually nature has the potential of becoming a really interesting asset class. If you take the coffee example, there is an argument today to basically buy traditional coffee assets as a financial investor. And from this coffee asset, which basically yields anywhere between 3 to 5%, through the migration of this coffee asset to basically a regenerative agroforestry system producing climate and nature positive green beans, you can basically generate about 20% IRR, 20% yield a year on that investment. And these are the kind of things that is going to start to mobilize private sector capital, and that is going to represent an interesting investment opportunity. With that, thank you very much, and I look forward for an interesting discussion later. Thank you very much.